Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thanks for joining us for the second event today as part of Unsilencing the Literary Landscape. And this is part of Freedom to Read Week. And today we're having a conversation with our librarian, James Moore, along with Phillippe Blouin from McGill, Kit Dobson from the University of Calgary. And we'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Montreal. And we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community. We help mobilize knowledge with daily activities examining research questions and projects happening all across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream as well to YouTube and Zoom. So if you're joining us there, comments or questions are important. Please pop those in to the chat. Our team will read those out a little bit later during a Q&A. Same with you here in the space. Just raise your hand and we'll run a microphone over to you. Okay. With that, it's very much my pleasure to hand the microphone back to our Associate University Librarian for Open Scholarship here at the Concordia Library, James Moore. Back to you.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you, Kit, and welcome for being here. Thank you for sharing some of your time today. Thank you, Philippe. I'm going to set the table for what I think will be a very interesting conversation. You both are. I selected both of you all to be a part of this conversation because your work, I think, ties very much into the discussion that has certainly become far more relevant over the past several years again, and that is academic, intellectual freedom, censorship. But I want to set the table by giving the audience a little bit of an overview of who you are and what you do, and then I'm going to ask some questions of each of you that's specifically related to your work. I also would like to find some opportunities to perhaps ask a question or two to both of you all that sort of gives you the opportunity to look at the issues from your particular lens. So, first of all, I want to, let's say this, to continue our exploration of landscapes that are being silenced, or how landscapes are silenced, not just in history books, but in our contemporary classrooms and on our local soil. We are joined by two scholars whose work challenges us to listen to what is often hidden in plain sight. Please welcome Dr. Kit Dobson. Kit is a professor at the University of Calgary and an award-winning scholar of Canadian literature. He is at the forefront of pedagogical resistance to censorship. I don't know if you're currently doing this, but I know that you have taught a class at the University of Calgary specifically dedicated to ban and challenge books. Beyond the classroom, his work including his recent nonfiction title, Field Notes on Listening, and his novel, We Are Already Ghosts, examines how we relate to place in the stories we are determined to forget. Also joining us is Dr. Phillippe Blouin, who recently completed his PhD in anthropology at nearby McGill University. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Blouin investigates the suppression of crucial information regarding the mistreatment of Indigenous people in Canada, drawing on traditional, and please correct me if my pronunciation is off, Kenian Kahaka, Ganyan-Gaihaka, or Mohawk,
yeah,
political philosophies to analyze Indigenous-led struggles. His work pushes us to move beyond the metaphor of unsilencing and into the practical political reality of restitution and justice. Together, they represent two sides of the same coin, one examining the creative and intellectual frameworks we use to understand the world, the other exposing systemic suppression of the truths that the world is built upon. So, just a quick overview. Dr. Dobson's work focuses on pedagogical resistance, teaching banned books. He explores literary biodiversities, which I think is such a fascinating term and viewpoint, and recommends deep listening and reading as acts of witnessing and justice. Dr. Blouin's work focuses on systemic suppression of information, how the state hides information regarding Indigenous genocide, explores land restitution, how silencing is used to maintain colonial encroachment on physical land, and he recommends heeding Indigenous voices and legal frameworks, which is going to be an interesting topic, to bring closure to buried histories. So I'm going to open with a question for both of you all. I'll start with Kit, and then it will tie to both of you all. So Kit, you've spoken about literary biodiversity, the need for a rich variety of stories to keep our culture healthy. Philippe, you deal with the literal burial of histories in the land itself. To start us off, how do you see the relationship between the stories we choose to ban in books and the truths we choose to bury in our national history? Kit, take a swing at it, and then Philippe.
For sure. And I know we did a pre-test with James. Can you just briefly confirm that my sound is good?
Your sound is excellent.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for your organizing labors today. Really appreciate that. I'm really grateful to be on this panel. And it's lovely to join folks at Concordia. Montreal is a place I'm very fond of and lived in the past for a period of time as well. Yeah, I have so many things to say, and I will have to endeavor to sort of keep myself on point for sure. So please feel welcome to cue me as well.
Okay.
Yeah, coming to you folks from Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta. I think one of the things I'm really conscious of right now is, thinking about book banning and censorship is the provincial government here has been very much at the forefront of the conversations that have been happening nationally. We have a provincial government that has shown itself directly interested in book banning and censorship, even against claims where they will say they're not doing these things. Freedom to Read Week here in Calgary right now has a real sense of urgency to it, and so I'm really glad that this organizing is taking place. And I'm in conversation and communication with lots of other folks who are thinking about these concerns. One of the things that's been really interesting to me for the last few years, and perhaps I'll talk about some of my work in the classroom a little bit later. So I anticipate coming back to that. But one of the things I'm thinking about right now, and it really has to do with that question, James, about story, and so what are the stories that we heed? What are the stories that get buried? What are the stories that get forgotten? What are the patterns that attach to that? And I'm really keen to hear from Dr. Blouin on these questions too. I find myself thinking a lot about what it is about story that is just perceived as so very dangerous. Over the last 5+ years now, there's been this massive upswing in attacks on books, attacks on libraries, librarians, freedom of information, freedom of expression. For those who may not yet have seen it, there's a recent documentary coming out of the United States. It's called The Librarians. I really urge everyone to watch that documentary.
Showed it last night.
Yeah, fantastic. I did see that. So folks who were able to see it there last night, awesome. If you haven't, I really urge you to find an opportunity to see it. It's chilling and it's shocking.
Indeed.
One of the things I've really been struck by in all of this is, what it is about story itself that seems to be just so dangerous, or that is prompting this sort of widespread repression against the different range of stories. And so I'm testing out this hypothesis right now, and so I'm really keen to be in dialogue with folks who are thinking about this. One of the things I find myself landing on is that stories provide us. And books provide us with nuance. They provide us with narratives that are complex, they're narratives that are rich, and narratives that are ultimately really ambiguous. It feels like in a very polarized society that people are looking for simple answers or easy answers. I'll go right to the point right now, saying like when I look at the State of the Union address from the U.S., or I look at the rhetoric that I'm seeing just politically often being coming at me all day every day, people seem to be looking for really simple answers, and I'm very concerned about some of the answers that my provincial government is proposing to what I think are really complex and nuanced problems. My government seems to be proposing very simple answers that I just don't think account for the complexity of the world. And I think it is story and narrative that has the capacity to give us that kind of complexity and that kind of nuance in my teaching. And briefly to talk about my teaching, one of the virtues I will often try to highlight in text is ambiguity,
Mhm.
ambiguity or ambivalence. And in literary studies, when a text is ambiguous, one of my students wants to say, it means this one thing. I'll say, no, no, no. It means these seven different things. Let's talk about ambiguity and let's hold on to ambiguity because that is actually how, we can develop empathy for text, for readers, for people coming from different walks of life. We can develop that sense of complexity that's really necessary to take on big problems. And, we can really grapple with, what the world offers us.
Mm.
And for the longest time in my career as someone, literary scholar, people would say, "Oh, nobody reads books anymore. Books aren't important. This is sort of, forgotten or bygone kind of way of addressing the world." And suddenly, books are really important again. They're so important that people are literally burning them. And when I, try to think about why it is that, books and narrative and story has been such a focus, this is what I'm really arriving at. That possibility of nuance, that possibility of complexity, ambiguity and ambivalence that really invites us into actually accounting for the complexity of the world and not accepting simplistic answers for complex problems. I'll pause
Thank you.
there. Yeah, hand that over. That's my starting
Thank,
point. Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you. Very layered, interesting perspective. So to go back to it, Philip, you deal with the literal burial of histories in the land and thinking about what Kit had to say about the power of stories. How do you see the relationship between the stories we choose to ban in books and the truths that we choose to bury in our national history?
Yes, well, thank you, James, and thank you, Kit. Nice to meet you. And I mean, I'm very inspired by what you say, Kit, about ambiguity. This is finally what I came across. For my PhD, I've been accompanying this group called the the Mohawk Mothers, a group of survivors and Indigenous elders from a community of Ganawage nearby. And I've been accompanying them in investigating and acting as a cultural translator of sorts in their court proceedings to halt excavation work at an old hospital in Montreal, the old Royal Victoria Hospital, where there were allegations from a survivor of medical experiments, psychiatric experiments in the 50s and 60s that are known more widely by the public as the MK Ultra experiments funded by the CIA, although many other parties were involved, the Canadian Army notably. And this survivor, Lana Ponting, who lives in Winnipeg now, she was there at 16 in this psychiatric department of McGill University and the Royal Victoria Hospital. It's called the Allen Memorial Institute. When these experiments were happening and she witnessed the presence of Indigenous children and of burials happening outside. These experiments, just to summarize, were actually the Americans thought back then that the Soviets had developed methods for psychological modification and control, what we call brainwashing. And so they wanted to get an edge on the Soviet methods and themselves launched this sweeping project that was, across dozens of American universities, but many experiments happened in Montreal, which also kind of, covered them legally. Just recently, there's been the Attorney General of the U.S. was, the court did not include them in the class action suit brought by survivors and their family members for those experiments. And so the Mohawk Mothers went to court with, the sworn statement by Alana Ponting to investigate, implement archaeological searches to find these burials. But they were based entirely in their own culture, which is oral history-based culture. And so in my PhD, I kind of analyze how their interactions happen with the record, considered as the white man's paper trail burden of sorts. This notion of the record as something that would be unambiguous, precisely following, a conception of truth and evidence that still prevails in the courts, even though, as an anthropologist, paradoxes do exist, but in a legal sense, everything is either true or false. And the record, in my PhD, I analyze different types of records, the ethnographic record itself, which is used as some sort of tool of blackmail, in a sense, regarding Indigenous oral history, and specifically Kanien'kehá:ka, because they were, one of the peoples on the East Coast that had a very well-organized system that the first settlers encountered. So there's many, records from the colonial era that are used against them, that are measured against their own oral traditions about their own governance system and the way they live. But also the archaeological record, which in the case of burials and of generally of telling the history of indigeneity in Canada, is a thoroughly ambiguous sort of record, which you can tell so many different stories with. If you find evidence of palisades around old villages, this can be considered evidence of warfare or of the absence of warfare, depending how you cross-reference it with different types of evidence. But there's all these archaeological narratives also that seek to give an unambiguous, unilateral, vision of history. And then the legal record as well, which is really based on this principle of non-contradiction and of, the powers that be giving this narrative about itself as something making sense, something non-contradictory. And, through these rulings, building this narrative of the exercise of power and of law as something that is not ambiguous, something that is inherently right. And so I analyze these records from the standpoint of the Turo Wampum, which is the traditional provision of the Kanien'kehá:ka that was exchanged with the first settlers to determine the relationship between settler peoples and indigenous peoples. And it basically has two parallel lines, and it's an alliance wampum belt. And so it says that to move in the same direction, you have to maintain separate parallel paths so that there's no encroachment, whether in the form of assimilation or cultural appropriation. And so I sort of see the records-based Western ideology as its own path, and analyze how this path behaves in a way to bring it in a parallel line with the indigenous tradition, to try to find a way to read through these records in a way that is consistent with what oral history said, and to try to make sense of it. And so that's the way I try to approach it.
Let me follow up on that a little bit. So the way, whether it's written or oral history, the way that history is preserved can act as a function of sort of the power to control the narrative. Where does the concept, please explain the concept of archival amnesty and how that can function as a form of state-sponsored censorship against the victims of institutional abuse here?
Well, I would say maybe we can see it in two different ways. All these medical experiments, for example, it was clear there was an order to destroy all the files related to the MKUltra experiments from Richard Helms, the director of the CIA, in 1973. But then some financial records were not destroyed, and they were discovered by journalists eventually, and then it broke out the story, and there was a United States Senate commission about it. And in a similar way, there was, different waves of destruction of archives about, the Indigenous genocide in Canada. There was a big paper scrap drive in the 1930s and 40s, destroyed 15 tons of documents. Then everything related to healthcare at very small retention periods. After 2 years, all the records are destroyed. So there's entire, swaths of history that are no longer accessible. For example, all the pass system where Indigenous people needed a permit to exit their reservation, for example, this all disappeared. It's no longer available. The paper trail itself
Did they give a
was
story
destroyed.
for the reason for the destruction of 15 tons?
No, it's only guesses that historians, can make as to was this intentional. Sometimes even the trace of the destruction has been destroyed itself. You know, so there's this aspect of the outright destruction, and so then it's a matter of proving the absence of an
the absence of
the presence of an absence.
the presence of an absence.
But then there's this other aspect where the record that does exist, especially when we're thinking about medical records that subsist, from periods of medical experimentation, for example. The institutions that author these records are aware, of a liability, that they will hold for the future. And so, there's some records, I think it was in Naomi Klein's book, the shock doctrine, where she does talk about the MKUltra experiment. She came across some records. It was a conversation 1953 between a guy from the Defense Research Board of Canada, Morton, who was the first graduate in psychology from McGill, by the way, him and a psychiatrist from McGill, Dr. Donald Hebb, who started all this sensory deprivation experiments, which ultimately made their way into the CIA's counterinterrogation manuals and are still, used in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and all that. And so they discussed, Dr. Hebb wanted to release some of his discoveries, because he was proud. He thought he had discovered that you can create momentary schizophrenia out of sensory deprivation. And for him, this was of scientific interest, but it was funded by the Army, and it was about susceptibility to propaganda under sensory deprivation. And that's also an aspect that he saw, people will be more gullible once you submit them to, once they're deprived of their senses. But this director of the DRB, Defense Research Board, told him, no, you cannot mention that, but you can try to mention other aspects of the experiments that aren't, related, just to drain off the attention of the curious,
Okay.
So that's the way he puts it. So when you're accessing these records, that they know that people are going to access it and it's going to be read in a certain way. So the experience of survivors, which they experience as, traumatic abuse in these treatments, are presented as medical progress in the records. It is not seen as a problem. Sometimes just because, some time has passed. Back then, it wasn't contentious to do such experiments on children without any, consent from the family. So sometimes you kind of see that there was a problem, but that is when you deal with these records, you're dealing with people who are curating a record.
Correct. I think that hits at something that Kit said earlier, which is, and I've heard this spoken in different ways, which is storytellers control the world. Like this. Statistics can tell any number of stories depending on the story that you want to tell. So to pivot back to your work, Kit, I have the feeling that you're probably a little younger than me, but we're somewhere in the same area with regard to generations and our relationship to reading. You said something very interesting to me. For years, there was this feeling that, reading was irrelevant. Even from my perspective, libraries were irrelevant because Google was coming. And it's kind of paradoxical, but the whole debate and discussion, the fight that people are having in the movie The Librarians, seems to suggest that this stuff is still very, very important, or else people wouldn't be fighting about it. So I'm wondering, you've brought these texts into a formal classroom setting. And I'm wondering how your students, a student that a generation that many people feel can't really sit with long form reading of information, can't barely finish a 2-hour movie, that their sensory systems are literally being reshaped by technology. How do you feel? Do you think they are any less sensitive to these bans than, say, our generation, or these attempts to ban or limit their opportunity, not specifically books?
Yeah. No, it's a fantastic question, and it is one that I've been grappling with a lot. And I think to link to Philippe's comments about archives and sort of the role of archives too. When I'm teaching banned books, and I can talk a little bit about the structure of that course too. One of the things I do so is with an awareness of, we'll often say that, if a book gets banned, that's great publicity for a book. It'll end up being, picked up and become a bestseller as a result. And that's sometimes true, and that tends to be true of the books that I'm teaching in that course. But then also there are lots of books where, that face various kinds of censorship and repression and actually do vanish out of the records or the popular or imaginary when those things happen. So there's also, I think, an archival aspect there too, of sort of, not too quickly kind of saying, oh, book bans are good for a book. They're not always. The story is much more complex than that. So thinking about archival recoveries, I also think about the kinds of texts that then disappear and or are become more and more forgotten over time, and to go back and then look at what those records show. To think about my classrooms now, I mean, I think there's data to support the idea that a younger generation than us, James, a younger generation of folks are statistically reading fewer books. There's data to support that. There's different kinds of reading. I like to think about reading in a really expansive kind of sense. Yeah, and I'm sure folks in the library sciences also think really dynamically about reading, what reading looks like. And so, I'll tend to say, there's data that suggests generation by generation difference, but I would not say that my students are, they're not apathetic about these questions by any means. They get very animated by, certainly the idea that there are other folks out there who are going to tell them what their freedoms may and may not be. Students tend to get animated about that very, very quickly. So one of the questions I've been asking asking my students, and the course that I've been teaching, even alluding to, this is a first-year course at the University of Calgary. It's designed for 120 students, so it's a large lecture format course. It is typically students who are first-year students, often have recently completed their high school educations, often, although not always, graduates from the Alberta system, but really broadly attending from a range of different disciplines. It's a course that fulfills the first-year requirement for students in our business school, our engineering program, our nursing program, as well as all of our arts programs. So it's quite, it's very diverse in terms of the student populations in that class. And so it's an interesting challenge to me to teach that group of students who may or may not be particularly bookish. Many of them are not. Many of them are very explicit in saying they're there to fulfill a degree requirement and then never take another literature course and move on. And that's fine. I find that that's an animating challenge for me to then be able to say, okay, what's important here? What are the things that you need to know? And so I start by asking them, what's your response if somebody out there, let's say our government, in the case of Alberta right now, it's questions about the kinds of policies that the provincial government is putting in place. What's your response when somebody tells you you can't do a thing, or this is a text you shouldn't read? And I say that overwhelmingly, although not necessarily 100% the case, but overwhelmingly my students will immediately say, okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to access that text. I want to find out what I'm being told not to read. What is the what is the material that's being deemed dangerous or inappropriate for me, and I'm going to find out what's in it and make my own decisions about that. So that's overwhelmingly the response. And I will say for this class, that drives part of what then goes on in the classroom space. I do endeavor to be thoughtful and sensitive about the demands on students' lives. I think it's also in terms of my generation going to university versus the generation of students I'm teaching now, they're beset by different concerns and anxieties than I was. They tend to be facing greater student debt. That is, again, statistically true. They have different kinds of demands. They are often trying to balance full-time jobs and full-time student loans, as well as, or so teaching loads, class, as well as, in many cases being caregivers and, having many demands on their lives. So I try to be thoughtful about that. The last iteration of this class was this fall. I invited my students to read 6 books, and I will say that a lot, many of them, as far as I can tell, read the books, and that was really satisfying. Yep, and they're not necessarily just short books. The first one we read was Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, a novel that was
Which
very
was banned
notorious in its
at
day.
one
Yeah,
point.
you bet. When Lawrence finished it in 1928, he was unable to secure publication for it, had it privately printed in Italy, died not too long after. The book was basically suppressed, or it existed in pirated versions between then and its vindication in courts in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And the students found that book. There's a lot to say about it, and there continues to be a lot to say about it. And it's not, it's not a short book. It's got a fairly high demand on the reader, and I do find that my students are engaging. So I certainly, while recognizing, there are definitely changes and different pressures and different things happening generation over generation. My students tend to get really animated about questions of censorship and repression of knowledge really, really fast. And to me, that's it's gratifying to see that engagement for sure.
Thank you. So I'm going to say a name to you, Philippe, and I would like for you to share some of your thoughts with this name. Luis, you got to help me say this.
Garunyakdaje?
Garunyakdaje Hall.
Yeah.
Tell the audience some about Luis Garunyak Hall.
Yes, actually, well, you must have seen the warrior flag, actually called a unity flag, that, with the head of an Indigenous person with the sun in the background on a red background. And so this was painted by this man, Louis Garunyakdaje Hall, who was a knowledge keeper from the Mohawk community of Kahnawake, who, was a painter, a very sort of DIY painter. I mean, he would use wall paint and paint on, the plywood and things like that, in his own workshop, but a prolific painter and also a writer, a polemicist, we should say. I mean, he wrote this, the Warrior's Handbook in the 80s, which then became this, kind of pamphlet that the Indigenous warriors would read. And it's written in both his paintings and his writings are really in this polemical sort of, very much inspired by advertising and kind of counter-propaganda kind of thing. He talks a lot about psychological warfare. And so I edited a book with Mohawk community members and some friends from New York a few years ago, 2023 actually. We launched it in this very room, the Mohawk Warrior Society, a handbook on sovereignty and survival. It's at PM Press. And so it's basically, there's some of his artwork, but also it's a compendium of materials that he wrote and also testimonies from community members who started this, rekindled the fire of the Mohawk Warrior Society in the 70s. And it had never been officially edited before. I mean, is it a banned book? It's not been banned because it's not been published. I mean, it was self-edited and put out there, but if it was published, it could have been banned back then because it's very militant in its tone. And it's the kind of thing that, I mean, there's all this community of thinkers, of Indigenous tradition of resistance, that has a literature, but that is very self-consciously putting itself out there politically, using sort of the white man's role of the record and putting something on the record for people to see, which is, and the funny story behind the Mohawk Warrior Society is that, it's It's a translation of the traditional word rotiskanagete, which is the word for all the men. Actually, it's the men's responsibilities, which are associated with the sun. It's to provide warmth and light to Mother Earth, because it's a matriarchal society, really, where, you know, the village and decisions are held by the women. The men's role is sort of a provider. But then it's Louis Garunaktadje Hall who translated this into Mohawk warrior society, consciously to scare off the colonial powers and get more bargaining power, to reinforce the negotiating position of the community. And this created this, big revival in the 70s, which actually eventually led to the 1990 Oka crisis, where warriors were also involved. But this translation, warrior society, gives the idea that it's some sort of official, group, sort of paramilitary group or something. Whereas Rotiskanagete is the responsibilities, it's a gendered responsibility that is akin to the women have caretaking responsibilities, which the group I'm working with at the Royal Victoria Hospital, it's the women, the Ganistansra. There's a word for the umbilical cord. It's an umbilical relationship with the land that they have. Whereas the men, it's this responsibility as providers, which, in moments where it's needed, when there's some, conflict with the Canadian Army, like in 1990, well, all the men in the community will show up and be present, But it was sort of consciously put out there as a negotiation, kind of, tricking the record. And so, that's something I worked on.
So let me ask you this. It seems to me that there's like a fundamental tension. When we talk about literature, and to go back to what Kit said, I see it very expansively. Like, it could be however you share and tell your stories. It could be oral tradition, written tradition, could be now digital tradition. And I know that there was some tension even in sort of arguing the legal case for bringing to light the experiments and et cetera that had taken place at the Old Vic. And help me to understand this. I want to see if I got this right. So there's the tension there between what is seen as sort of the Western European mode of record keeping and storytelling, written, static, versus the oral tradition, which, for lack of a better term, is a more living tradition.
Absolutely.
How do you reconcile that if you're trying to win an argument in court?
Yeah. I mean, there's, in oral history, there's specific procedures for, record keeping without a record. It's sort of done on purpose to, to conserve the ambiguity, in a sense, of meaning itself, that it's reopened for interpretation. An agreement that's recorded in a wampum, specific words are spoken into the wampum, and those words are open for reinterpretation for the next generations, according to their new, challenges,
circumstances
of the day, rather than, a contract, for example, has the words there, and they're always ambiguous. Will you do the etymology of all the words? And that's something that happened in court, because at some point, Mohawk Mothers signed an agreement with McGill and the Quebec government to have some experts decide on what would happen. They won an injunction first, and then they signed this agreement, and there would be a panel of experts who would determine all the techniques to be used on the site. And it's been happening since. But the wording was ambiguous in a way where Quebec government and McGill kind of took control of the investigation at some point, said, oh no, well, they're just supposed to name which techniques will be used, but now not how they will be used, because that wasn't specified there, And so, and it's written there that we will manage the execution of the technique, so we become the the decision makers, you know.
Right.
But then you have to analyze, what does manage mean exactly? You know, is
Right.
that decision making? What is execution related to? You know, but that doesn't, you know, yeah, it goes in circles.
Yeah.
Just in a way where finally it's just one guy, a judge, who will decide, you know, just out of his own, you know. So that's kind of, you know.
And a lot depends on his worldview and his or hers.
Yeah, I mean, the
beliefs and background.
unbiasedness of
Yeah,
this
yeah.
society is very
Yep.
biased in its own way.
Yep. So, pivoting, biodiversity in literature. So I think this is a fascinating point of view, and if you could see the poster for our event, it is an image of a tree with different books, and some of them have been removed. The books are the leaves, and some of them have fallen to the ground. So you're currently leading Literary Biodiversity in Western Canada research project. What is the risk to our cultural, and first of all, I would love to hear some about the genesis of this project, and then to hear your thoughts on the risk to our cultural and intellectual ecosystem when diverse stories are silenced.
For sure. I have a lot to say there too, and will endeavor to keep myself on point. To what Philippe was just saying about the sort of the ambiguity of contract language or legal language.
Yes.
We have to also a great demonstration of why we need literary scholars and why literary scholars, students come out of an English degree and then end up in the taking legal studies often. Law students often come out of English degrees. And I think it's that sort of partly is exactly that sort of ambiguity of language. And those kinds of arguments are, ones that I'll stage in my classroom, but then are also ones that have like great legal ramifications, like just really significant. So very important in mind, that sort of importance of language all of the time.
I should have said this. Pause that thought, Philippe, because it seems to me that the Mohawk tradition, is acknowledging that the truth is always going to be somewhat ambiguous, that language is always alive, and the best that we can do is reach an approximate understanding, because it changes with the context, and as opposed to a contract which says this is always true or this is written in stone, which is not really how life is functioned.
Well, not only Mohawk tradition, but all of us as human beings, that's our experience of life, you know. And just we're always looking at the past from our vantage point.
Exactly.
Through our language.
And that changes the more we live and the more we experience and so on.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Fascinating. Sorry to cut you off.
And no, it's spot on, because it brings back to the question of diversity of views, diversity of opinions, and ultimately biodiversity too, and links between human and non-human as well. That is part of the interest of that project. For that particular project, is thinking at the intersections of the human and more than human worlds, and ways in which
how does the non-human come into? I'm curious. How is that? Are we talking digital? Are we talking mammals?
Mammals, trees, fungi, you name it. And what are the ways in which in various literary contexts those kinds of conversations are taken up, both between humans for thinking about environment and land, then also very much beyond that. From my own subject position, I'm not going to make any claims about Indigenous knowledge, but also certainly reading alongside and reading with and in community with Indigenous knowledges too, and the conversations that take place are. Philippe was talking about relationships between between community and land, and I think those are really important to respect in this context as well. So that project has been endeavoring to think for the last few years about some of the questions about biodiversity in a literary context, and I think it's a great way to think too about the range of possible expressions within story and the kinds of narratives that we're able to bear witness to. One of the things that's been really, really clear, a lot of this, the best data from this is coming out of the United States. The American Library Association in particular has been gathering very good data on book censorship and book banning over the last 20 years. One of the things that is emerging with a great deal of force, and is one of the things that I want to really emphasize in any of these conversations, is that the texts and the authors who are facing repression are coming from 2S LGBTQ plus communities and BIPOC communities. So there's a clear pattern of disproportionate representation of texts either about these themes or from these communities that are being targeted and that are indeed being removed from libraries and from circulation in a range of different contexts. And I think that's a really, really important piece to come back to again and again, and know that is a particular kind of organized suppression of particular voices and particular.
Well, let's go a little deeper on that. Be more specific, like why? Why do you think these particular voices,
Yeah.
this particular time,
Mm-hmm.
are the ones that are most likely to be silenced or challenged?
Yeah, I would say it comes down to racism and homophobia and transphobia and various kinds of, honestly, a fear of different kinds of stories and perspectives. And
Mhm.
I really think that it's important to just name that for what it is from what I'm seeing. Yeah.
So you know what? That I think there's a lot of truth to that. I also think that, one of the librarians on our panel last night said that a lot of her challenges actually came early on.
Mhm.
Now more of these challenges from the right, but earlier on, a couple of years back, a lot of her challenges came from the very progressive left,
Yep. Yeah.
who want certain certain images or stories that they thought were insulting or unflattering to traditionally marginalized people. And
Yep.
I've experienced some of that too, having worked in public libraries. Now, the conversations were generally civil.
Mhm.
The persons who did that were generally like, hey, I just, I'm concerned. But they did listen and they were willing to accept my answer. But she seemed to say that more of those challenges were coming from the left just a little while back, maybe during the sort of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and now that it's really switched hard to the right. Is that something you're seeing?
Yeah, very much so. I think it's important to acknowledge, I think, that trajectory and like very recent shifts too. And so a recent book that has been published on the subject, Ira Wells's book on book banning. That's
Mm-hmm.
a book on book banning that I encourage folks to go out and look at. Wells's argument is in effect that book banning and censorship is something that spans the political spectrum, and that it looks comparable on the left and on the right.
Could you
And
tell something about the story? I think the school district in Ontario that he talks about.
yeah, and there's a few, and that book is actually looking at a lot of the similar case studies, some of the
Uh-huh.
same case studies that I've been looking at as well. And
Okay.
yeah, Wells in his case goes and gets involved on the ground level to, with the school district that his kids are at, and sort of narrates through the
Right.
process of being involved as a parent with looking at the kinds of books that are being subject to removals. And Wells is able to say in that case, sort of document some of the ways in which that work was being done, perhaps less thoughtfully than it might have been, and in a more slipshod or haphazard kind of way. And he raises a series of concerns about that I think are really, really fair. Um,
So for the context, let me share a little context
yeah.
to the. So for the context, it was a group of, I think we agree, well-meaning
Mhm.
school leaders in a school district in an effort to decolonialize their library collection. They removed like 50% of the books. They removed all the books published before 2008.
Yeah.
And that was something like 50% of the books in the school library. And the students, books like Diary of Anne Frank, Harry Potter, and students complained. And I think their intentions were good,
Mhm.
but they did it. They did it too. So I don't know if it's simply just prejudice that makes people do this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that we've got to hold on to again the complexity and the nuance of it. And in that case,
Mm-hmm.
the Peel District School Board, they ended up very publicly being called out for this. It ended up in the media and
Mm-hmm.
being widely covered, and they agreed to go back and revise their policies. and ultimately restoring a number of those books while continuing that dialogue. And I think Wells' intervention actually plays a role in some of the long-term fallout of that story too. So that I think that's really, really key. I think it comes back to me partly, when you're talking about some of the things that you saw a few years ago, of having individuals come in and challenge titles, but then be willing to engage in civil discussion and debate with you, and to take your point, which there's a range of different responses I think that come from progressive circles about the potential harms of say racist representations, and then the at the same time the importance of holding on to those as part of the historical record, which we've seen debated in a lot of different contexts. I think one of the things that for your librarian who is sort of suggesting a recent shift is, and here I'm thinking of a different book by Naomi Klein, her recent book Doppelganger, which is a really, really chilling book. One of the things that Klein argues in that book is that the political right has done a very good job of seeing strategies and tactics from the political left or from the progressive side that either sort of fall out of favor or are less completely realized, or don't particularly work because the left is notoriously terrible at arriving at consensus, and tends to devour itself, right, in one form or another, and that the right has become really, really effective at seeing those strategies, picking them up, and consolidating them and using them with force, and in fact, often much more effectively. And so when we're looking at, again, like with a documentary like The Librarians, I would say I can see a version of that happening there, where one of the things that is happening on the ground is like really well organized movements that are dedicating themselves to challenging books, again, like the data showing the rise in the suppression of 2S LGBTQ plus and BIPOC texts and authors. This has become an organized movement at a completely different scale now. We're like a few hundred titles being challenged here to now thousands of titles, and just mass challenges taking place.
It's largely, my understanding is that your province, Alberta, is sort of what's the word I'm looking for? The nexus, sort of the hotbed. Is that fair to say for Canadian challenges?
It is right now. There are some very sort of specific places where we've seen it. In the outside Vancouver, in the Fraser Valley area, there have been a number of challenges there. Manitoba's reported a number of them. There have been sort of different pockets of them here and there, but right now Alberta is where we're seeing a lot of it, particularly with with the active involvement of the provincial government, and a lot of the policies that are being brought up here, and a lot of the rhetoric is a lot of this, very similar rhetoric to what has been happening in the United States over the last few years. Rhetoric out of Florida, out of Texas, out of Idaho. It's being picked up and brought here. Really kind of feels like wholesale.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. So just so you both know, we're getting about to the 5-minute point, and I want to probably ask both of you each one more question. So Philippe, something that Kit said rang a bell to me, because he was talking about, this really difficult, complex question of people who are trying to reveal more truths and perspectives on the history of the past. Also, not trying to have certain dominant voices so amplified. I think that would be decolonizing that effort to bring more balance there, but also respecting intellectual freedom. So I know in the U.S., there was this huge tension, especially around the time the George Floyd murder brought a sort of reckoning to all of us to ask questions that we previously felt that we couldn't or didn't want to. And there was this feeling that around the world there was a taking down of like monuments, and I know in the U.S., there's this sort of uncomfortable degree of monumentation, if that's a word, to Civil War leaders from the South, the Confederates who actually wanted to tear our country apart. and have their own country where they could practice slavery. I am not comfortable with that, and a lot of those monuments went up way after the Civil War. They went up during Jim Crow. But I can say, having gone to some place like Charleston, South Carolina, there's a power and an interest and a historical power, I guess, to seeing those monuments. That you go, for me, I should speak first person. Is it better for them to be there, or is it better for them to be taken down? Is it better to think about some sort of context? So I'm thinking about a parallel for you as someone with the First Nations history who was also an anthropologist, part of the academy. How do you look at some of the monuments to people in Canadian history who, frankly, may have been extremely damaging to Indigenous people, but you also have a role in studying and revealing the truth about the country for deeper understanding? How do you, like, what do you think should be done about certain monuments?
I don't know if it's my job to say, but I mean, some of those statues were taken down. I think John A. Macdonald in Montreal was taken down. And some, I mean, like the push that happened in Ryerson University in Toronto, the statue was taken down and university ended up changing their name to Toronto Metropolitan University. Same kind of movement is happening at McGill. McGill being a slave owner. The statue was taken down. They didn't put it back, but the newspaper, the student newspaper, the McGill Tribune, dropped the McGill from their name. They're now just called the Tribune. So there's a movement for that. But McGill invested a lot into its trademark name, so I don't think they're anywhere close from doing that. But it's, I would say it's perhaps the biggest challenge in the work I try to do, accompanying, aging survivors at a time where the institutions that victimize them are being transformed into new infrastructural hubs of this new sort of economy. I'm thinking not only the Royal Victoria University becoming this sustainability park and new kind of sustainable development campus, but there's other places. There's what used to be the biggest psychiatric hospital in Canada, the Saint Jean de Dieu Hospital, which is still a psychiatric ward now, but there was mass graves in the vicinity in what used to be the fields where people worked, basically as slave labor there, incarcerated people. At a certain time, there were 5,000 people in that building. There were little trains inside moving between wings, and people barely know that history. I grew up in that neighborhood. I barely knew it myself. But now there's the Quebec's liquor board that wants to build a new automated warehouse to send its liquor all over the place, and it's exactly where that used to be. And so we were in negotiations with them to try to bring some search dogs and protect some graves, and we were unsuccessful. They did not want the dogs to be brought in because in true preceding construction projects, they had found more graves that they said were excavated. Anyways, a very contentious story, and evidence of crimes against humanity there. But how can you get those institutions to commemorate, what happened there when it's atrocities that are too big to even speak of? I mean, just the reality. It was called the pigsty cemetery, so that just speaks to the horrors that. So
they basically they buried children, if I'm right, who they had experimented on next to a pigsty.
Yeah, it was all this generation called the Duplessis orphans. Duplessis orphans who were kind of wrongfully, they changed their status to psychiatric patients while they were orphans to get more federal funding. That was it's a well-known story in the 50s what happened here. And then they were used as slave labor, but also for these medical experiments. Lots of the first antipsychotics were tested on them. So that's one side. And currently we're in discussions with Hydro-Quebec about another site in downtown Montreal, the Hospital of the Miséricorde, where all the unwed mothers used to give birth. So I mean, it's quantities of babies were born there. All the children born out of wedlock were, for most of them, taken by the state and sold for adoption, for profit back then. And I mean, many of those orphans were born there, and now Hydro-Quebec wants to make it this new electric station, the powerhouse for all of downtown, inside the same building, you know? And how do you tell the story of what happened there? How do you keep a record of what happened? That will do justice both to the victims, but also, I mean, they were victimized by nurses, often who were nuns as well, who often themselves were victimized, who were orphans, who became, you know, trapped in that system, who became the nuns themselves, you know. So how to make justice to all these different points of view in extremely contentious, you know, stories about violence, and for the page, you know, to be turned properly in a way where it's not just erased entirely, which is what's happening right now, because those institutions do not want to talk about what happened there.
Wow, that's a lot to digest. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wrap it up, and here's what I'm going to do. So I think about this, like what you just shared, and I really appreciate your honesty, because these issues are so complex, and it's everything you do, it just has a trade-off. You know what I mean? So the way I deal with this is I always go, okay, you look at the enormity of the challenges in our world, and I go, what can I do to make my sphere of influence better? If I can do something like that, then that's good. So I'm going to ask both of you all, ultimately, what do you hope to ultimately achieve through your work in your sphere of influence that can make things a bit better, understanding that you'll never be able to solve all of these enormously complex questions and challenges related to your work?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. That's a great question, and I think it's a good one for bringing us together. For me, I mean, it comes down to, for me, you know, literary arts are a really important art form. There's many different art forms. That's the one that has always called me. So holding on to the capacity of art to present us with complex, nuanced conversations that don't provide us with simple answers, but provide us with the richness, the meaning, and the complexity that, you know, reflects our world in meaningful and important ways, is ultimately where I want to dedicate my energy. And so for me right now, that's become, you know, I'll say the work on book banning and censorship hasn't been at the center of my work until very recently. It's really taken over my life as a result of recent, you know, political, social events. But I feel morally compelled to be speaking on this issue, and really doing so in the service of art and the complexity and beauty that can bring to our lives. And that's where I want to dedicate my energies.
Thank you. It's a great answer. And you, Philippe?
I would maybe come back to an expression you used, Kit, about the bearing witness. I mean, we can only do so much as human beings, but you know, I see it as a minimal task to also try to put these erased voices, you know, amplify them and keep them in the record, with the trust that somewhere down the line in the future generations, people are going to do something about it, you know, that it's going to stay there somewhere, and keep the record ambiguous enough for, you know, this single-handed version not to just, you know, erase the other visions. And I have somewhat, you know, good trust in the future for that, just thinking about my Mohawk friends, how their own culture at some point, I mean, they were almost entirely exterminated and became refugees in Canada after the American Revolution. And I mean, it's always like the danger, the imminent danger of everything disappearing. There's no new generation that speaks the language enough, you know, to keep it going, but it always somehow happens. You know, there just has to be a thin thread that will be picked up by these future generations.
Very well said. Okay, We're at the end, and they've been very generous with their time. I think out of respect for their time, okay, we are going to, how about we open it up for one question from the audience that could be put to both.
And I can say, if anybody wants to follow up with me, I'm very easy to find on the internet.
Or we could do that. We could just say it's a wrap and then have the audience follow up.
We can have a question for sure. I welcome it. But if I do welcome follow-ups from folks.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah, and everyone joining us online, if you have comments, questions, put those in the chat. We'll keep them and we can move them all around. Do we have any question in the space? No? Okay.
Okay. People are trying to run. It's lunchtime. Thank you both so much. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. And what a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, James.
All right.
Much.
Cheers.
All right. Thank you, Kit, Philippe, James. Thanks everyone also for joining us online as well. We're going to close up our Zoom. We're going to close up our live stream. We'll say goodbye to Kit. Thanks again for joining us. This conversation does remain available on our YouTube channel, and you should definitely revisit it. And have a wonderful, very snowy afternoon.